the quadratic formula notes. So the first thing that we're going to look at is just that the quadratic formula of what the quadratic formula is. So the quadratic formula is x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all divided by 2a. Now notice that the part that's in the square root is the discriminant that we were working with last week. So if you have the discriminant, just remember what that means, and we can relate that to the quadratic formula. Now when we're looking at the steps for solving, the first step is you want to get your equation in the form of ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. So step 1 is get your equation to look like ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. Then the second step is just determine what your a, b, and c are. So if we look at the equation, then we can see that a is next to x squared, b is next to the x, and c is by itself. And we'll make sure that that equals 0. Now the third step is plug in a, b, and c. So what that means is taking the a, b, and c from this and plugging it back into the quadratic formula. And then the last step is just simplify. Now we're going to go through some of the examples. So the first example, we already have it looking like ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. So here our a is 1, our b is negative 6, and our c is negative 12. So if we plug that back in, we have x equals negative 6 plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c. Then we divide all of that by 2 times a. So when we've done those first 3 steps where we've gotten this in the way we want it, determined what our a, b, and c were, then we've plugged it in, and now we just want to simplify. So when we're simplifying, we can see that this is just going to be the negative 6 is just 6. You want to do plus or minus the square root of that determinant. So here, we can just type that into the calculator. So here when we're typing that in, we want to do negative 6 squared minus 4 times 1 times negative 12. So you see that is 84. So if we go back to here, we're going to see that we want to put 84 right here, and that's the discriminant. And we see that that means that we're going to, since it's positive, we're going to get 2 real answers. And we can just make that a little simpler to make it 2. So next step is just simplifying 84. So what we were looking at last week is that we can break this down, this 82. We can break it down into a couple things. So we can break it down into 2, and then what do you multiply by 2 to get 82? 84. We're working with 84, not 82. So you can break it into 4 or break it into 2 and 42. And you can break this down into 2 and 21. You can break this 21 down into 3 and 7. And then there's nothing else to break it down into, but we see the pair of the 2 and the 2. So that's going to end up giving us 2 times the square root of 3 times 7, which is just 2 times the square root of 21. So then we can take that and plug that back in. So when we're looking at this equation, we have 6 plus or minus 2 times the square root of 21 divided by 2. So the way we can simplify this just a little bit more is we know that 6 is divisible by 2 and 2 is divisible by 2. So we can factor a 2 out of what's here on top. So we get 2 times 3 plus or minus the square root of 21. And that whole thing is divided by 2. But now we've got 2's here that can just cancel out, with which just leaves us with 3 plus or minus square root 21. And what this plus or minus means is that we have 3 plus the square root of 21 but we also have 3 minus the square root of 21. So remember, when we looked back at the discriminant, and since it was positive, we have 2 real answers. These are 2 real answers. We have x equals 3 plus the square root of 21, and we have x equals 3 minus the square root of 21. And these are as simple as our answers are going to get. So then we have the next example where we don't quite have it in the form that we want it yet, because we have it equaling 14 and we want it to equal 0. So to fix that, we want to go 12x squared, because that one's fine, minus 38x. And then we want to subtract the 14 from the other side, and bring it back to this side. So then we have minus 14 equals 0. So then we have it in the form that we want it. We've done that first step. Now the second step is just figuring out what our A, B, and C are. So A here is 12, is negative 38, and C is negative 14. And then we're just going to plug that back in, that x equals negative B, which is negative 38, plus or minus the square root of B squared minus 4 times A times B, all divided by 2A. So when we're simplifying this down, we have the 38 plus or minus the square root of the determinant here. So as we're going to go back to the calculator, and we're going to want to type in negative 38, and we're going to square that, minus 4 times 12 times negative 14. Then we just hit enter. That'll give us, for our discriminant, 2,116. And we have all of that divided by 24. Then the next thing we're going to look at the calculator again because we need to figure out what's the square root of 2,116. So, looking at that, it's just 46. And since that's a solid answer, we can just plug that right back in. So then we have 38 plus or minus this 46 all divided by 24. So then we get into our two answers. X equals 38 plus 46 divided by 24. Second one is going to be 38 minus 46 divided by 24. So those are our two answers, but we can simplify those down a little more. If we have 38 plus 46, that's going to be 84. So we have x equals 84 divided by 24. And then with our other one, we have x equals negative 12 divided by 24. So with this one, if we want to get this as simple as we can, we want to figure out what that's going to be. So here we can simplify that down into, we can look at the calculator again and look at 84 divided by 24 gives us 3.5. And then negative 12 over 24 and I did this wrong. That's not negative 12. That's negative 8. So here, instead we want to have negative 8 divided by 24, which is going to give us better answer of so that's going to get us negative 0.33333. Repeating, but we also know that can just be written as negative 1/3. So the next example that we're going to look at, again, we don't have it quite in the form that we want it. So to get there, we want to subtract 12x from this side, bring it over here. We also want to add the 5 over. So then we're going to end up with 2x squared minus 12x plus 18. And that's going to equal 0. And that's going to give us the form that we wanted. So then from there, we can determine our a, b, and c. A is going to be 2. B is going to be negative 12. And c is going to be 18. So then it's just taking that and plugging it back into that quadratic formula. So negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c, all divided by 2a. So this is going to simplify down into 12 plus or minus the square root of negative 12 squared. Or this is where we're just going to look at the determinant again. So we're going back to the calculator. And we're just going to look at negative 12 squared minus 4 times 2 times 18. We're going to see what we get. And that's just 0. So we see that our determinant here is 0, which, remember back to last week of what we were learning about the determinant, then if we have a determinant of 0, we know we have one real answer. So this comes back down. Square root of 0 is just 0. So we have 12 plus or minus 0 divided by 4 equals x. But since this is 0, it's just 12 divided by 4, which is 3. So our answer is just x equals 3. Now this next example we're going to look at, it's a little bit harder to get to where we want it to be because we have to subtract 2x squared from both sides, and we have to subtract x, and we have to add 2 to get 0 on this side and to get everything else on the other side. So then we just get x squared minus 4x. And then we get plus 7 equals 0. Then from here, we can just figure out what the a, b, and c are. So a is 1, b is negative 4, and c is 7. Then we just got to plug those into that quadratic formula. So we get x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c, all divided by 2a, which is going to simplify down into just 4 plus or minus the square root of the determinant, which, when we go back to the calculator, we're going to see is negative 4 squared minus 4 times 1 times 7. That's going to give us negative 12. So, looking back to the determinant, when we have a negative number in there, we know that we're going to have no real answers. That means our answers are going to have an imaginary number in them, which makes sense because we have a negative in the square root. Like we were learning last week, that means that you have an I, which is the imaginary number. So, when you're left with this, you're going to simplify that down, and you're going to want to try and figure out what the square root of negative 12 is. So, you have a 12, and when you're trying to break that down into things so you can simplify it, you can break that down into 2 and 6. You can break your 6 down into 2 and 3. Then you see that you have a pair of 2's. That means you're going to bring those out, and you just have a 2 times the square root of 3. But since it was negative, you want to make it sure when you're putting it back in here, you have 4 plus or minus 2i times the square root of 3, because that I takes care of that negative in the square root. And you want to divide it all by 2. Now, a lot like the first example, we have a 4 there and a 2 there, and both those are divisible by 2. So we can bring that out and turn it into 2 times 2 plus or minus I times the square root of 3. And divide that whole thing by 2. And since we have a 2 on top and a 2 on bottom, those will cancel out, and we just have 2 plus or minus I times the square root of 3. And then it's just looking at that plus or minus and seeing that we have our two answers. That's 2 plus I times the square root of 3, and x equals 2 minus I times the square root of 3. And those are going to be our answers in the simplest way that we can put them. And that's what we're going to get for that last example. And that's the notes for the quadratic formula.